Hey everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to be looking at animations for the sprite that we sliced up in the last video. We'll set up an animator to transition between two animations. We'll add a player controller script to control the animator. And we'll also flip the sprite so that you can reuse the run animation so that you can run left and right without having two separate animations. Okay, so let's get to it. The first thing I'm going to do is look at my player. Player has a single sprite on it right now. It also has a rigid body 2D. The important thing about this is that when you add the rigid body 2D, we only want to move left and right, and you may want to move up and down. Since this is a 2D game, we're going to freeze the rotation at Z so that we don't have any awkward problems. I'm also going to set the gravity scale to 0 so that when I press play, the player doesn't just fall down. Okay, so with that done, and the player selected, I'm going to go to the animation window. If you can't find the animation window, it's Window, Animation, Animation. Got it now. I'm going to click Player and click Create. And I'm going to create a folder for this. I'm going to create an animations folder. And the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to create a player run. So now that that's created, I'm going to drag this window up here just to make it a little bit easier for myself. The player run animation I know is across player 2 to player 8. Drag them all in. I'm going to click play so they can watch them as they play. This is a little fast and looks a bit ridiculous, so you can drag the end bar with everything selected and drag it out, and that will slow the animation right down. This allows you to play with it a little bit. Once I'm happy with this animation, I can move on and start creating the player idle animation. I'll click this drop down and click Create New Clip. I'm going to rename it and call it Player Idle. I'll select the 3 sprites here and drag them in the exact same way as I did for the run cycle. Test out what it looks like. I'll click play, and here we are. Might be a bit slow. Again, once I'm happy, I can stop and move on. Now that we have the two animations, we need to set up the transition between the two. To do that, I'm going to go to the Animator window. You can get to the Animator window in the same manner as the animation window. So it's Window, Animation, and Animator. With the player selected, I can see both the animations I created here in the Animator window. The player run animation was the first one I created, so it has a transition to it from the entry point. We don't want the player run animation to be the first, so I'm going to right click on the player idle animation and set as layer default state. This means that when the game starts and the entry point triggers, we can move straight from the entry through to the player idle animation. Now I want to transition between the player idle and the player run. So to do that, I have to right click on the player idle and click make transition. This gives me an arrow here. I can click on the player run and now I've got a transition to the player run. I'm going to do the same in the opposite direction because I want to be able to transition from idle to run and then from run back to idle. At this point, we need to update those transitions. So I'm going to click the arrow here. So there's a few things we need to change. First thing is I want to remove has exit time. The reason I want to do that is because I don't want any blending. Unity will make an attempt to blend between the two animations, and it can look a bit strange. It can really work out well if you know what you're doing, but for this project, we're not going to do it. I'm going to remove that, and then I need to set a condition. So we only want the player to move from idle to run when the player is moving at a certain speed. And to do that, I want to add a parameter. I want the player to have a speed parameter on his animator so that I can set that speed parameter and then adjust the animations based on that. To do that, I go over here to the Animator window. If you've got layers selected, just click Parameters, click the plus, click Float, and we'll call it Speed. Now, it's defaulted to 0. When I click over here, has exit time is still clicked off. I can click to add a condition. And I want to move from idle to run when the speed is greater than 0.01. And there we have it. We're going to do the same in the opposite direction We're going to change the has exit time to remove it. We're going to add a condition, but this time I'm going to set speed to less than 0.01. And that's it. I've saved it, and I'm going to run. And when the game starts, instantly my character is into the player idle animation. You can test out the transitions by changing this value. Gone to 3, so the player is running. 0. And he's running. Okay. It looks like that's working. Now that we have the player animations working, we need to be able to control that from the player controller. And to do that, we're going to actually have to create a player controller. So I'm going to click on player, close up all of these, and I'm going to create a script called player controller. By default, this gets created at the top level in the assets folder, but I don't want that, so I'm going to create a folder called scripts, and I'll move the player controller into there. So now it's time to start writing some code. I'll open the script. If we're going to move the player, then the first thing we're going to need is a movement speed. I'm going to create a variable up here. I'm also going to create a vector2 to store the movement that the user inputs. Now that we have those variables, the next thing to do is start taking the user input. So the way we can get the user input is by using input.getAccess, and we can use horizontal because we only want moving along the x-axis, so left and right. I'm going to create a new vector2 and use input.getAccess horizontal for the x value. And since I don't want to move up or down, I'm going to set the y value to 0. Now that I have that, I want to make sure that I get a consistent value. I'm going to normalize it. And when I normalize it, it means I'm going to get a consistent value in the right direction, but the length is limited to 1. And then I'm going to store that in that movement variable I created earlier. It's best practice not to actually move your player in the update function. For that, we should use fixed update. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to check if the movement vector is equal to 0. We don't want to move if it isn't set to something. So if it is set to something, we can actually do some movement. We already have a movement vector, but that movement vector is the direction, not the movement. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the x movement by doing movement.x. We'll multiply it by the movement speed. And then we'll multiply it by time.delta time. Next, I'm going to move it. So what's this doing? We're getting the current object's transform, and then we're translating it in a direction. The direction we want to translate it in, we create a new vector3, and we set the x value that we've calculated on the previous line. And then because we don't want y to move up or down, we just set that to 0. And then we're done. That means that we should have a player that's moving. Now, the player moves, but he's not animating. Let's get to that. I'm going to switch back, and we're going to start looking at the animation. So to animate the player, we're going to need access to the animator that controls the animation. I'm going to create an animator variable up here. And in the start function, I'm going to get the animator component attached to this object. Then what we need to do is set that speed variable that we were talking about earlier, that we created in the animator. And to do that, we're going to go to the update function. We're going to use animator.setFloat. We're going to use the name that we created, which was speed. And then we're going to use the movement variable. But we want to make sure that we get a positive value. So I'm going to do math f dot absolute, so I get the absolute value, and then I'm going to use the movement. I'm going to use the magnitude and multiply that by the movement speed. That should set our values properly, and we should have an animating player. And there we go. But now you're looking at this and thinking, going right is perfect, going left, we need to flip that sprite. And that's really easy. I'm going to move back to the player controller script, and I'm going to update the update function. In here, we need to figure out if the sprite should be flipped. So I'm going to create a flipped variable, a boolean, and I'm going to set it to movement.x less than 0. So this means that it will be true if the movement.x value is less than 0. So if we're moving left, then it should be flipped. So now that we've done that, we need to rotate the sprite. And to rotate the sprite, all you have to do is set the rotation. We're going to use a built-in function for it called quaternion.euler. And what that does is it rotates around the x, y, or z axes by the amount you provide. So we are going to provide a new vector 3. We don't want to rotate around the x axis, but we do want to rotate around the y. So if it needs to be flipped, then we're going to rotate 180 degrees on the y. If not, we won't rotate at all. And nothing on the z. So with that done, we're going to have to make one more change. We're going to have to change how the translation is done down in the fixed update. Currently, the translation is done relative to the object's local axis. But what we want is for it to translate based on the world coordinate system. That will mean that left will always be left, right will always be right, because we're working on the world coordinate system, not on a rotated local coordinate system or axis. So with that done, we should have an animated sprite. He's working. So that's how to animate a player and flip the sprite. Hopefully you've got something useful out of that. And if you did, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.